At 6:30 in the morning on April 7th, 1944, I was lying flat in the jungle mud on a hillside in northern Burma, called NHPMGA. I pressed my face into the wet earth and stayed perfectly still while I listened to Japanese soldiers talking just 30 feet away. They were calmly discussing how they planned to kill me and every other American on that hill before sunrise. What they didn't know was that I was right there. They didn't know I understood every single word they were saying, and they definitely didn't know that the information I was picking up in that moment would turn their planned attack into a slaughter for them. My name is Staff Sergeant Roy Matsumoto, and I was one of about 600 American soldiers trapped on that hilltop. We'd been surrounded for 9 straight days. Our water had been completely cut off. Japanese artillery and mortars had pounded the ground around us non-stop, blasting deep craters into the earth. Dead Japanese soldiers lay all around the perimeter. Their bodies were bloating and rotting in the tropical heat, and the smell was so overpowering that the men who survived would later rename this place Maggot Hill. We were Merrill's Marauders. The Japanese force surrounding us belonged to the Imperial Japanese Army's 18th Division. This was the same division that had conquered Singapore and Malaya just 2 years earlier. The same unit that had humiliated the British Empire and forced over 80,000 soldiers into captivity, the greatest surrender in British military history. That division had never been beaten, not in China, not in Malaya, not in Burma. Their troops were seasoned jungle fighters, veterans who'd campaigned all across Asia, and they outnumbered us almost 4-1. What happened over the next 12 hours would completely change how the Japanese viewed fighting Americans in the jungle. And it would be just one of 35 battles where this sick, exhausted, undersupplied group of American volunteers would defeat the conquerors of Singapore. But our story didn't begin on that hill. It began with a promise that never should have been made. In August of 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Quebec to talk about the war in Asia. At that point, Japan completely controlled Burma. The Burma Road, the critical supply line into China, had been cut. China was slowly being strangled. The Allied leaders decided that the answer was an American ground unit that would operate deep behind Japanese lines in Burma. This unit would sabotage supply routes, cut communications, and cause chaos in the Japanese rear, while Chinese forces attacked head-on. Roosevelt called for volunteers. He warned the mission would be dangerous and hazardous. That was all the detail we were given. Around 3,000 American soldiers stepped forward. Some of us came from jungle training camps in Panama and Trinidad. Others were hardened veterans from Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and New Georgia. A few came from stateside units, itching to see combat. And some came straight out of military stockades, trading prison time for a shot at redemption. But every one of us shared the same promise. The Army told us the mission would last about 90 days, 3 months behind enemy lines, and then we'd be rotated home. That promise was never meant to be kept. We gathered in India in late 1943 and were officially designated the 5307th Composite Unit, Provisional, codenamed Galahad. None of that meant much to us. What stuck was the nickname war correspondents gave us after visiting our camp. They named us after our commander, Brigadier General Frank Merrill, Merrill's Marauders. Merrill was 40 years old, a West Point graduate who'd served as a military attaché in Tokyo before the war. He spoke fluent Japanese and understood their culture better than almost any American officer in the theater. But he'd never led troops in combat. He was a staff officer, not a battlefield commander. The man who truly built the Marauders was Colonel Charles Hunter. He trained us, organized us, and prepared us for jungle warfare. Everyone expected Hunter to lead us into combat. Instead, General Joseph Stilwell, commander of U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India theater, put Merrill in charge. Hunter was pushed down to second in command. We felt it immediately. We trusted Hunter. We barely knew Merrill. But orders were orders. On February 24, 1944, about 2,750 of us crossed into Burma. We were split into 3 battalions, each divided into 2 combat teams. Red and white made up 1st Battalion. Blue and green were 2nd. Orange and khaki belonged to 3rd. 6 combat teams, total. About 400 men in each. We had no artillery, no tanks, no guaranteed air support. Just the occasional supply drop if the weather allowed. Everything we carried was what we fought with. M1 rifles, bars, Thompson submachine guns, 60mm mortars, bazookas, and mules. 360 mules hauled our ammo, radios, and limited supplies through terrain where no vehicle could ever go. Waiting for us ahead was the Japanese 18th Division. Their commander, Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka, was no amateur. He'd served at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, one of the most powerful positions in the Japanese army. He was a planner, a strategist, and a firm believer in Japan's destiny to rule Asia. His division's reputation was legendary. Formed in 1907, the 18th had fought across China, including the capture of Nanjing in 1937, but their defining moment came in December 1941 during the invasion of Malaya under General Tomoyuki Yamashita. That campaign was a masterclass in speed and surprise. Japanese troops landed on the northeastern coast and drove south through jungle the British believed was impassable. They used bicycles to move infantry where vehicles couldn't go. Again and again, they appeared behind British defenses, attacking from directions no one expected. The 18th Division landed at Kota Baru and swept down the Malaya's eastern coast, capturing airfields, supply depots, and defensive positions with ease. When the British tried to form a defensive line, the Japanese simply flowed around it. Singapore was supposed to be untouchable. Churchill called it the Gibraltar of the East. Its massive guns faced the sea, ready for a naval assault that never came. Instead, the Japanese attacked overland, crossing the Johor Strait from the north, an approach the British had failed to defend properly. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore. Over 80,000 British, Australian, Indian, and Malay troops went into captivity. It was the largest surrender the British Army had ever suffered. The 18th Division had earned a name for itself, the Conquerors of Singapore. Among their own ranks, the soldiers called themselves the Chrysanthemum Division, named after Japan's imperial flower. They wore their reputation like armor. They had shattered the British Empire's image of invincibility and proved in their minds that Asian soldiers could defeat European armies in the jungle. After Singapore fell, the division was moved into Burma. They helped push the last British units out of the country, driving them west all the way into India. Once there, they locked down the Hukong Valley, cutting off any Allied effort to build a supply road from India to China. That was Tanaka's assignment: hold the valley, block the Ledo Road, and destroy any force that tried to push through his territory. Tanaka commanded roughly 7,000 men. These weren't green troops. They were veterans who'd fought all across Asia, masters of jungle warfare. No American infantry unit had ever faced the 18th Division before, and Tanaka saw no reason to worry. To him, Americans were soft. They depended on machines, heavy weapons, and overwhelming firepower. He believed they couldn't survive in the jungle. He was about to learn how wrong that belief was. We didn't attack the Japanese head-on. That would have been suicide. We had no armor, no heavy artillery, and we were badly outnumbered. Instead, we used the same tactic the Japanese themselves had mastered in Malaya. We went around them. We pushed through jungle so thick it blocked out the sun. We crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and came at the enemy from directions they never thought possible. We showed up where they never expected Americans to be. Our first objective was Wallalbum, a small village that served as a supply hub for the 18th Division. General Stilwell ordered us to set up a roadblock south of the village. The idea was simple: cut off the Japanese escape route while Chinese forces attacked from the north. Getting there took 8 brutal days. We hacked our way through bamboo thickets and waded through streams that reached up to our chests. We climbed ridges so steep that mules lost their footing and plunged to their deaths. The heat and humidity drained the strength out of us. Leeches clung to our legs. Dysentery was already tearing through the ranks. The jungle itself felt like an enemy. Some bamboo groves were so dense our machetes barely made a dent. Thick vines grabbed our gear and tripped men trying to move quietly. The undergrowth hid snakes, kraits, and cobras, whose bites could kill you in hours if antivenom wasn't close by. The jungle never went quiet. Birds screamed without warning. Monkeys crashed through the canopy overhead. Every sound could be a Japanese patrol. Every shadow might hide an ambush. But we had advantages the Japanese didn't expect. Kachin tribesmen served as our scouts and guides. The Kachin people had suffered horribly under Japanese occupation. Their villages had been burned, their families tortured or murdered, women were raped, men were executed for the smallest act of resistance. They hated the Japanese with a burning intensity, and that made them invaluable allies. The Kachin were mountain people native to the highlands of northern Burma. They knew trails that didn't exist on any map, paths even British colonial officials had never charted. They moved through the jungle without a sound and read signs in the forest that American eyes couldn't see. The Office of Strategic Services had already been operating in Burma through Detachment 101, recruiting and arming Kachin guerrillas. For months before we arrived, these Kachin fighters had been ambushing Japanese patrols, sabotaging supply lines, and gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. When we crossed into Burma, Kachin scouts were attached to every battalion. They guided us along hidden trails that bypassed Japanese outposts. They warned us of enemy patrols, sometimes hours before we'd ever make contact. They showed us where to find safe water and where to set up camps. One Kachin leader in particular became vital to us, Xingtong Na. He led scout teams far ahead of our columns, mapping Japanese positions and finding weak points in their defenses. The Kachin asked for very little in return: weapons, ammunition, and the promise that America would help free their homeland. They got the first 2. The third remains a debt history never fully repaid. Without the Kachin scouts, we would have been blind in the jungle. With them, we could see what the Japanese couldn't. And there was another advantage the enemy never suspected. 14 Japanese-American soldiers served with us as translators and intelligence specialists. These Nisei, second-generation Americans whose parents had immigrated from Japan, spoke Japanese fluently. Their presence was both remarkable and unsettling. These men were Americans. They were born in places like California and Hawaii. They grew up playing baseball and going to American schools. Yet after Pearl Harbor, Their own government labeled them potential enemies. In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9266. It authorized the forced removal of around 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Families were sent to internment camps, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. They lost their homes, their businesses, and their freedom. Not because of anything they'd done, but because of who their ancestors were. And from behind that barbed wire, some of them volunteered to fight for the country that had imprisoned them. One of those men was Roy Matsumoto. Roy was born in Los Angeles in 1913, but his life crossed the Pacific more than once. When he was 8 years old, his family traveled to Japan to visit relatives. What was supposed to be a short trip turned into 9 years. Roy went to Japanese schools. He learned to read and write the language. He absorbed the culture, and more importantly, for what came later, he picked up the regional dialects. The one he knew best came from the Hiroshima region, where his family had deep roots. When Roy eventually returned to California and worked as a delivery boy, many of his customers were immigrants from Hiroshima Prefecture. He heard that accent every single day. He could spot it instantly. After Pearl Harbor, Roy and his family were sent first to the Santa Anita racetrack, which had been turned into an assembly center. They slept in horse stalls that still smelled like manure. From there, they were shipped to the Jerome internment camp in Arkansas. Roy could have let bitterness take over. He could have refused to serve a country that treated him like an enemy. Instead, in the fall of 1942, he volunteered for the United States Army. The Army quickly recognized his language skills. He was sent for specialized training, and before long, those skills would place him in one of the most dangerous roles imaginable, deep behind enemy lines, Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage, Minnesota. That's where Japanese-American soldiers like me went through intense training in translation, interrogation, and intelligence work. It wasn't easy, but I finished at the top of my class. When volunteers were requested for a classified mission in Burma, I didn't hesitate. 13 other Nisei soldiers stepped forward, too. We all understood the risks. If the Japanese captured us, they wouldn't see us as prisoners of war. They'd execute us as traitors. And if any of us still had family in Japan, those relatives would likely suffer for it. We went anyway. So there I was, deep in the Burmese jungle, using the language and skills I'd learned growing up in Japan to help kill Japanese soldiers. It was a contradiction that defined the lives of thousands of Japanese Americans in the war. Our loyalty was questioned at home, yet we proved it on battlefields across the world. On March 3, 1944, our unit reached the blocking positions near Wallobum. 3rd Battalion dug in south of the village along the main road. 2nd Battalion moved into position to the east. The trap was ready. That's when I stumbled onto something that would save hundreds of American lives. While out on patrol, I noticed telephone wires running through the trees, Japanese field lines. I borrowed a handset from a signals officer, climbed up into a tree, and tapped into the line. I listened as Japanese soldiers spoke with their headquarters. They were using the Hiroshima dialect. It was the same accent I'd learned as a kid delivering groceries to Hiroshima families back in California. I understood every word. They were talking about an ammunition dump. Only 3 guards were assigned to it. They even gave away its location. I passed the information up immediately. American aircraft struck the dump not long after. The blast lit up the jungle like daylight. But the Japanese didn't stay confused for long. General Tanaka realized his rear area was under threat and reacted the way Japanese commanders always had. Fast and aggressive. He ordered 2 full regiments, nearly 4,000 men, to smash our roadblock. The Battle of Wallabum lasted 4 days. Japanese infantry attacked in wave after wave. We held our positions, firing disciplined rifle shots into the advancing troops. Machine guns mowed down those who reached our perimeter. Mortars rained shells onto Japanese assembly areas. The fighting was close, personal. In the thick jungle, many engagements happened at less than 50 yards. You could see the faces of the men you killed. You could hear the wounded screaming on both sides. We had one major advantage. Almost every American carried a semi-automatic or automatic weapon. The M1 Garand fired 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. Bars laid down brutal, suppressive fire. Thompson submachine guns were deadly in tight jungle spaces. The Japanese, by comparison, carried bolt-action rifles. They had to work the bolt between every shot. When seconds decided who lived and who died, that difference mattered. The Japanese also discovered something else they hadn't expected: our marksmanship. We'd trained hard in Jungle Lane, firing, shooting at moving targets through gaps in thick vegetation. We could hit a man-sized target at 100 yards, even in broken terrain. On the second day, Japanese troops tried to swing around our flank. A patrol from 1st Battalion spotted them first and set up an ambush near a narrow river crossing. When the Japanese moved into the water, our machine guns opened up. The river turned red. About 400 Japanese soldiers were killed in that single engagement. We also learned something that went against everything we'd been told. The Japanese soldier wasn't suicidal. When they were surrounded, outflanked, or taking heavy losses, they pulled back. They fought hard, but they could be beaten. Even General Tanaka barely escaped capture. American and Chinese forces nearly overran his headquarters. He was forced to retreat in a hurry, abandoning supplies and equipment behind. By March 7th, the Japanese withdrew. They left behind an estimated 400 to 500 dead. We lost 8 men killed and 37 wounded. The numbers were shocking. It was the first serious defeat the 18th Division had suffered in Burma. But we didn't get time to celebrate. General Stilwell immediately ordered us to move again. That 90-day promise was already gone. After Wallabum, we pushed south toward Shaduzup, then on to Inkanga, setting up more roadblocks to choke Japanese supply lines. The pattern never changed. March through impossible terrain, dig in, fight off counterattacks, move again before the enemy could bring overwhelming force to bear. At Shaduzup, 1st Battalion blocked the main Japanese supply route and held it for 3 days under constant assault. When Chinese troops finally relieved them, they found the jungle around the position carpeted with Japanese bodies. At Inkanga, 2nd and 3rd Battalions joined forces to block another critical road junction. Japanese units attacked from several directions at once. We held. We always held. But the jungle was killing us just as surely as enemy bullets. Daytime temperatures climbed past 100 degrees. The humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion during marches. If you fell, you were carried or left behind. Malaria spread fast. Burmese mosquitoes carried Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest strain. Even with Atabrain tablets, turning our skin yellow and causing hallucinations, men dropped sick by the dozens. Cerebral malaria killed quickly. Survivors often relapsed for months or years. Dysentery was everywhere. Both amoebic and bacillary forms tore through the unit. Some men cut holes in the backs of their pants so they could relieve themselves without stopping. They called them Burma pants. It was a dark joke, but it fit. We also learned too late that Chinese units we were coordinating with used jungle streams as latrines. the same streams we drank from. The Chinese troops boiled every drop of drinking water as a matter of routine. We didn't. Americans were trained to trust halazone purification tablets, and most of us drank straight from jungle streams. Those tablets killed bacteria, but they did nothing against the parasites that caused amoebic dysentery. Men who skipped boiling the water paid for it fast and hard. Food was another problem. The K-rations we carried provided about 2,800 calories a day. That might have been enough sitting still, but we were burning 6,000 calories or more just trying to survive. Those rations were meant for short emergencies, not weeks of nonstop combat. They lacked protein, vitamins, everything a body needs when it's being pushed to the edge. The weight fell off us fast. Uniforms hung loose on bodies that kept shrinking. Men who'd gone into Burma weighing 180 pounds dropped to 140 or less. We looked like famine refugees instead of infantrymen. Our feet were rotting, jungle rot, a fungal infection fed by constant moisture, ate into the skin between our toes and spread across the soles of our feet. Some men could barely walk. There was no time to dry out. There was no dry ground to stand on, and Stillwell kept pushing us forward. By late March, new orders came down. We were to move to a village called NHPMGA, dig in, and hold a defensive perimeter while Chinese divisions continued their advance. It went against everything we'd been built to do. We were a long-range penetration unit. Our job was to hit fast and disappear, not sit in fixed positions. We had no artillery, no reinforcements, and no reliable way to evacuate wounded except by small aircraft landing on jungle clearings. Colonel Hunter protested. General Merrill overruled him. Stillwell's orders were final. On March 28th, 2nd Battalion reached NHPMGA and started digging in. Within hours, Japanese troops surrounded the hill. What followed was an 11-day siege. About 600 Marauders held the high ground against more than 2,000 Japanese soldiers. Day and night, artillery and mortars hammered us. The Japanese dragged mountain guns through the jungle just to blast our perimeter. Explosions came every hour. Shells slammed into foxholes, trees shattered, spraying wooden splinters like shrapnel. We learned to read the sound of incoming rounds. A high-pitched whistle meant the shell would pass overhead. A deep, growing roar meant it was coming right at you. Our only water source, a small stream at the base of the hill, became the most fought-over piece of ground in Burma. Control of that stream changed hands again and again. Men died trying to fill canteens. Eventually, the Japanese took it for good. Days passed without water. We collected dew from leaves at dawn, squeezing a few drops into our mouths. We rationed what little we had, taking tiny sips that barely touched the thirst. Some men drank their own urine. Others licked moisture off rocks. Dehydration killed just as surely as bullets. Wounded men lay trapped in foxholes. Evacuation aircraft couldn't land under the constant fire. Medical supplies ran out. Surgeons operated without anesthesia. Morphine was saved only for the worst cases. Men died from wounds that should have been survivable. We couldn't bury the dead. There was no safe ground to dig. Japanese fire swept every open space. Bodies were stacked along the edge of the perimeter, covered with ponchos when we had them. Japanese dead from failed assaults lay where they'd fallen. The tropical heat sped everything up. Within days, corpses bloated and burst. Maggots covered the bodies by the millions. The smell of death soaked into everything. You couldn't escape it. Later, the men who survived would rename the place Maggot Hill. The Japanese attacked again and again, probing for weak spots, searching for a break in our lines. Every assault was thrown back. Every attack left more bodies on the slope. They could afford the losses. We couldn't. During the siege, General Merrill suffered his first heart attack and had to be evacuated. Colonel Hunter took charge of organizing the relief effort. 1st and 3rd Battalions were ordered to break through and reach 2nd Battalion on the hill. It was during this siege, on the night of April 6th, that Roy Matsumoto did something that made him a legend among us. That night, we could hear the Japanese preparing for a major assault. Voices carried through the darkness. Equipment was being moved. Units were forming up. But none of us could understand what they were saying. Matsumoto went to his commander, Colonel McGee, and told him he was going out. McGee tried to stop him. It was too dangerous. Roy didn't back down. He stripped off his helmet, his jacket, and his weapon. Wearing nothing but his undershirt, he crawled down the hillside toward the Japanese lines. He moved inch by inch, pressing himself into the mud. If he was spotted, he'd be killed instantly. If captured, it would be worse. The Japanese showed no mercy to traitors, and that's how they'd see a Japanese American fighting against them. Roy reached a position less than 30 feet from a group of Japanese soldiers. He stayed completely still and listened. They were talking about the morning attack. They planned to strike a specific section of our perimeter at dawn. Their goal was to break through and wipe us out. Roy crawled all the way back and reported everything. Colonel McGee immediately reshaped our defenses. We abandoned our forward foxholes and rigged them with grenades. New positions were dug on higher ground. Firepower was concentrated exactly where the Japanese planned to come through. At dawn, on April 7th, the Japanese charged uphill, expecting to find worn-out Americans waiting in their old foxholes. Instead, grenades exploded among the lead troops. Those who survived pushed forward straight into a killing zone. Every weapon we had opened up at once. Automatic rifles, machine guns, carbines, everything fired together. Bullets tore through the attackers. Japanese soldiers went down by the dozens. And then Roy Matsumoto did something that bordered on pure madness. He stood straight up in his foxhole, completely exposed, and shouted in Japanese. He didn't yell randomly. He barked commands in the sharp, confident tone of an officer. He ordered the Japanese soldiers to keep advancing, to press the attack without hesitation. The enemy heard what they believed was one of their own officers urging them forward, and they listened. Japanese troops surged ahead, straight into our guns. What followed was total destruction. When the firing finally stopped, 54 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of our lines. 2 officers were among them. We didn't lose a single man. On April 9th, 1st Battalion finally broke through the Japanese lines and relieved the surrounded 2nd Battalion. The siege of NHPMGA was over. When 2nd Battalion came off that hill, they looked like ghosts. They had lost 57 men killed and more than 300 wounded. Hundreds more were suffering from dysentery, malaria, and typhus. But they had held, and once again, the Japanese 18th Division had been beaten. Roy Matsumoto was recommended for the Medal of Honor. When his commander was asked why Roy didn't receive it, the answer was simple and brutal. He was just an enlisted man doing his duty. Instead, Roy received the Legion of Merit. Decades later, he would finally be inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame. After NHPMGA, the Marauders were finished, physically broken. Since entering Burma, the unit had lost around 700 men to combat and disease. Many of those still standing could barely walk. Uniforms were rotting off our bodies. Boots fell apart. Nearly everyone was sick. The promised 90 days had long passed. We believed evacuation was coming, rest, medical care, recovery in India. General Stilwell had other ideas. The final objective was Mietkina, a town in northern Burma that held the only all-weather airstrip in the region. Capturing that airfield would change everything. Supplies could be flown directly into Burma, instead of risking the deadly route over the Himalayas, known to pilots as the Hump. Hundreds of airmen had already died flying that route. Taking Myitkyina would save lives far beyond our own. Stillwell ordered us to march and seize the airfield. The problem was the terrain. Between us and Myitkyina stood the Kumon mountain range, a wall of jungle-covered peaks rising over 6,000 feet. It was country the Japanese believed no army could cross, especially during monsoon season. Colonel Hunter was stunned. The men were wrecked. They needed rest, treatment, replacements. He formally requested that the unit be pulled back to India. Stillwell refused. The mission would continue. Hunter's objections were noted and ignored. On April 28th, what was left of the Marauders began the hardest march of the entire campaign. We were reinforced by 2 Chinese regiments and 600 Kachin Rangers, but the American infantry would lead the assault. The monsoon hit in full force. Rain fell in sheets so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Trails turned into rivers. Mud grabbed at boots and swallowed mules whole. Narrow mountain paths became death traps. Loaded mules slipped and plunged down mountainsides, their screams echoing through the valleys as ammunition and food vanished forever. Men who had bonded with those animals over months of misery could only watch. Disease-weakened soldiers collapsed on the trail. There weren't enough stretchers or bearers. Men were slung between poles, dragged through mud, carried waist-deep through water. Everyone slept soaked. There was no dry ground. Fungal infections spread across bodies. Scrub typhus, carried by jungle mites, started killing men who had survived everything else. Some soldiers finished the march barefoot. Their boots had simply fallen apart. The march to Myitkyina covered roughly 100 kilometers in just 17 days. When the survivors reached the outskirts of the airfield, only about 1,300 Marauders remained. Many could barely stand. But we had done what the Japanese thought impossible. We crossed the Kumon Range during monsoon season. Captain William Lagaren, the intelligence officer for the lead element, scouted the Japanese defenses and confirmed the truth. The garrison wasn't ready. They had no idea an attack force had crossed the mountains. The terrain was supposed to protect them. On May 17, 1944, the Marauders, alongside 2 Chinese regiments, attacked the Myitkyina airfield. Colonel Hunter commanded the assault. The attack began at 10 a.m. By noon, the airfield was ours. The Japanese garrison of about 700 men was caught completely off guard. They expected an attack someday, but from a different direction. American soldiers coming from the north, over mountains they believed impassable, shattered their defenses. Our final objective was achieved. The next day, General Stillwell flew in with war correspondents to celebrate. But the celebration came too soon. The town of Myitkyina, 5 miles from the airfield, was still in Japanese hands. Instead of pulling us out, Stillwell ordered us to help take the town. What was supposed to be a quick cleanup turned into a brutal siege that dragged on for another 2.5 months. Japanese reinforcements poured in through routes the Allies hadn't sealed off. The garrison grew to 4,600 well-armed defenders, far more than our exhausted force should have faced. We fought through the monsoon rains. Trenches filled with water. Foxholes became swimming pools. Combat was close, house to house, room to room. Men who should have been in hospitals were pulled from beds in India and flown back into combat. Soldiers running fevers over 103 degrees were ordered to keep fighting. Medical officers protested. No one listened. The unit that entered Burma with 2,750 men was reduced to a few hundred skeletal survivors. General Merrill collapsed again. His second heart attack, complicated by malaria, ended his command permanently. Colonel Hunter took over for the final push. On August 3, 1944, Myitkyina finally fell. The Japanese commander, Major General Genzo Mizukami, committed suicide the day before. About 600 Japanese soldiers escaped across the Irrawaddy River. The rest, more than 3,800, were killed or captured. 187 surrendered. For Japanese troops, that number was almost unheard of. 1 week after Myitkyina fell, the 5307th Composite Unit, provisional, officially ceased to exist. Of the nearly 3,000 men who had originally been assigned to the unit, only 130 were still considered fit for duty. Just 2 men from the original force had never been hospitalized for wounds or illness. Not a single horse survived the campaign. Out of 360 mules, only 41 came out alive. In a little over 5 months of combat, Merrill's Marauders had marched more than 750 miles through some of the harshest terrain on the planet. We fought 5 major battles: Walaubum, Shaduzup, Inkanga, NHPMGA, and Myitkyina, and engaged the enemy in more than 30 separate actions. 35 engagements in total, 35 fights against the conquerors of Singapore. And we beat the Japanese 18th Division every single time. The Japanese couldn't make sense of it. Their after-action reports were filled with confusion and frustration. According to everything they believed, American soldiers were supposed to be soft, undisciplined, and incapable of surviving jungle warfare. That belief had been reinforced by the easy victories of 1941 and 1942. But instead of breaking, the Marauders outflanked them, outmaneuvered them, and outfought them at every turn. We used the jungle the same way the Japanese had once used it against the British. We endured suffering that should have destroyed us. We kept fighting when logic said surrender was the only sane option. Japanese intelligence tried to analyze what made us different. They noted our superior firepower at close range. They observed our ability to operate for long periods without resupply. They pointed out our use of local guides and guerrilla allies. But none of that fully explained it. The real answer was harder to measure. We were volunteers. Every man in the unit had chosen to be there. We answered a call for a mission described only as dangerous and hazardous when we could have stayed in safer assignments. That kind of self-selection created a unit bound by motivation and shared purpose. And we fought for each other. After months of hunger, sickness, and exhaustion, discipline alone wasn't what kept men going. Loyalty did. Men who could barely walk stayed in line because they refused to leave their friends behind. They took one more step, not because of orders from distant generals, but because the man beside them took one more step. Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka, the commander who had helped conquer Singapore, was transferred in September 1944 to become Chief of Staff of the Burma Area Army. On paper, it was a lateral move. In reality, it ended his career as a frontline commander. His reputation never recovered from what the Marauders did to his division. By the end of the Burma campaign, the 18th Division was no longer an effective fighting force. The same unit that had crushed Malaya in 70 days and accepted the surrender of Singapore had been worn down by American infantry and Chinese troops in the jungles it once dominated. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese soldiers had believed they were unbeatable in jungle warfare. That belief died in the Hukong Valley, at an HPMGA, and at Myitkyina. The men who escaped Burma carried that knowledge with them. The myth of Japanese jungle supremacy was gone. British commanders who had been driven out of Burma in 1942 paid close attention. The tactics pioneered by the Marauders, long-range penetration, cooperation with indigenous guerrillas, aggressive patrolling behind enemy lines, shaped Allied operations for the rest of the war in Southeast Asia. When the British 14th Army returned to reconquer Burma in 1945, many of the lessons came straight from the Marauder campaign. The British had suffered their greatest defeat at Singapore. The Americans showed them how victory was possible. Recognition, however, came slowly. During the war, the unit received a Distinguished Unit Citation, the highest award a unit could earn. Every Marauder received the Bronze Star, an honor almost unheard of on that scale. 6 Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded, along with 4 Legions of Merit and 44 Silver Stars. But the men didn't feel honored. The promise of 90 days had been broken. Stilwell had driven the unit until it was destroyed. Hundreds died not from enemy fire, but from disease and exhaustion, losses that could have been prevented with rest and medical care. The War Department had predicted 85% casualties before the mission even began. They knew the cost. They sent the Marauders anyway, and kept them in combat long after any reasonable commander would have pulled them out. The survivors carried the damage for the rest of their lives. Malaria returned again and again, sometimes decades after the war. Amoebic dysentery caused permanent digestive damage. The psychological scars, watching friends die, fighting while sick, being pushed past human limits, never fully faded. Colonel Charles Hunter later wrote a scathing report on the campaign. He accused General Stilwell of misusing the unit and causing unnecessary casualties. He described what he called an almost complete breakdown of morale during the final weeks at Myitkyina. Not because the men lacked courage, but because they had been driven beyond endurance. An Army Inspector General investigation followed. Congressional hearings were held. The conclusions were damning. Stilwell faced no real consequences. He was recalled from the theater in October 1944, but for unrelated reasons. His ongoing conflicts with Chinese Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and British commanders who found him impossible to work with. Frank Merrill was promoted to Major General in September 1944. Despite failing health, he briefly served as Deputy Commander of American forces in Burma, then transferred to the 10th Army for the Okinawa campaign. His heart never fully recovered from the attacks he suffered during the Burma fighting. He retired from the Army in 1948 and became the Highway Commissioner of New Hampshire. On December 11, 1955, at just 52 years old, he died of a heart attack. He had recently been elected president of the American Association of State Highway Officials. The war had finally caught up with him. Charles Hunter was sent home from Burma by slow boat after Myitkyina, a deliberate humiliation for an officer who had dared to challenge Stilwell's decisions. And that was how Merrill's Marauders ended, not with a parade, not with rest, but with silence and scars that never healed. Colonel Hunter never received the recognition his leadership truly deserved. Instead, he spent the rest of his life speaking up for the men he had trained and led. He wrote a book about the campaign called Galahad, telling a version of the story the Army would rather have forgotten. In that book, Hunter explained what he believed defined the Marauders. They weren't supermen. They were ordinary soldiers who volunteered for an extraordinary mission and gave everything they had. The secret to their success, he wrote, wasn't their equipment or even their training. It was the simple decision to take one more step when every part of their body was begging them to stop. Roy Matsumoto stayed in the Army for another 20 years, continuing to serve in intelligence roles. After the war, He worked in China with the Office of Strategic Services, then served in Japan during the occupation. He retired in 1963 as a master sergeant. For decades, Roy rarely talked about what he had done in Burma. Much of his wartime service remained classified, and the role of Nisei soldiers in the Pacific stayed hidden for years. When asked about his experiences, Roy always said the same thing. He was just doing his job. In 1993, 49 years after NHPMGA, Roy Matsumoto was inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was honored not only for what he did on Maggot Hill, but for his intelligence work throughout the campaign. His discovery of the Japanese ammunition dump at Wallobum had been just as critical as his actions during the siege. 3 other Nisei Marauders would later join him in the Ranger Hall of Fame. Henry Gosha was inducted in 1997. Grant Hirabayashi followed in 2004. Their service to a nation that had questioned their loyalty was finally recognized. All 14 Nisei soldiers who served with the Marauders survived the campaign, a remarkable fact considering the casualty rates among their comrades. General Frank Merrill himself praised them after the war. Speaking about the Nisei group, he said, "I could not have gotten along without them." Their contributions went far beyond translation and intelligence. They proved that Japanese Americans, despite discrimination and suspicion, were just as loyal and courageous as any soldiers in the U.S. Army. At the same time, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was proving the same truth in Europe, becoming the most decorated unit for its size in American military history. After the war, the Marauders were reorganized into the 475th Infantry Regiment and continued fighting in Burma as part of the Mars Task Force through February 1945. When that unit was redesignated in 1954, it became the 75th Infantry. From that lineage came today's 75th Ranger Regiment. Every Ranger who serves now wears the Marauder patch. The 6 original team colors, red, white, blue, green, orange, and khaki, still appear on every Ranger beret. The modern Ranger motto, "Rangers Lead the Way," reflects the spirit of the men who marched through Burma 80 years ago. Camp Frank D. Merrill, near Dahlonega, Georgia, serves as the Mountain Phase training site for Army Ranger School. Every Ranger candidate who earns the tab passes through terrain named after the Marauders' commander. They learn the same skills of endurance, navigation, and small unit leadership that once kept men alive in the Burmese jungle. 30 members of the 5307th Composite Unit have been inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame, more than any other single World War II unit. In 2020, 76 years after the Burma campaign, Congress passed the Merrill's Marauders Congressional Gold Medal Act. The law recognized the unit's extraordinary service, bravery, and sacrifice during the 1944 China-Burma-India campaign. President Donald Trump signed it into law on October 17, 2020. The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest civilian honor the nation can bestow. It has been awarded to figures like George Washington, Thomas Edison, Rosa Parks, and the Tuskegee Airmen. Merrill's Marauders now stand among them because of the advanced age of the surviving members. The medal ceremony was held virtually on May 25, 2022. Only a handful of original Marauders were still alive. Russell Hamler and Gabriel Kenny were among those present. Kenny, the oldest survivor, had just turned 100 years old. They had waited nearly 8 decades for that moment. Most of their brothers never lived to see it. Speaking at the ceremony, Gabriel Kenny said something that captured what the unit meant to the men who served in it. He said that for Congress to finally recognize their service meant everything to him and his family. And for those who came home and passed away before seeing this medal, He hoped their descendants could feel the same pride. Army Chief of Staff General James McConville also spoke. He said the Marauders answered the call for the most dangerous missions. They fought in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. In his words, they represented the best of the Army and the best of the nation. Everything they did helped lay the foundation for today's Army Ranger Regiment. The legacy of the Marauders lives on in visible ways, through the Rangers and the Special Operations community, but also in invisible ones. They proved that human beings can endure far more than they believe possible when they fight for each other. The story of Merrill's Marauders isn't just about battlefield victories. It's about men pushed beyond human limits who refused to break. It's about promises made and broken by leaders who saw them as expendable. It's about Japanese-American soldiers fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families. It's about Kachin tribesmen risking everything to help strangers who came to free their homeland. And it's about what happens when ordinary men decide the mission matters more than their own survival. Years later, retired Lieutenant General Sam Wilson, who served with the Marauders and later helped create Delta Force, summed it up best. He said they were expendable. There was a plan to get them into Burma, but no plan to get them out. Winston Churchill called Burma the most forbidding fighting country imaginable. General George Marshall said the mission there was among the hardest of the entire war. They went anyway. They fought anyway. And that is why they are remembered. In the end, we won anyway. In the jungles of Burma, 3,000 volunteers stepped forward for a mission described only as dangerous and hazardous. Most of us never came home the same. Hundreds never came home at all. But we proved something that permanently changed how the American military understood what soldiers were capable of doing. We defeated the conquerors of Singapore 35 times. We showed that the Japanese soldier, despite the myth of jungle invincibility, could be beaten on his own ground. We marched farther than any American infantry unit in the war. We became the first American ground force to fight Japanese troops on the Asian mainland. We operated longer behind enemy lines than any other American formation, and we left behind a legacy that still lives today in the soldiers who wear our patch and carry our name. Rangers lead the way.